Okay, I guess people are beginning to roll in. I can see 4. Okay, just rolling. People are rolling in. Hopefully you can hear me. It feels a bit weird being one way. I can see myself and nobody else. Everything is fine. Thank you, Jan. I'll just get myself navigated to open. All right. I presume we're okay to start. What do you think, Jan? All right, cool. Let's go then. Okay, so let's talk about Meteor Kitchen. Meteor Kitchen is something I worked with a few years ago, and I was quite excited about it at the time to do some stuff with it and to help collaborate. So I'm going to talk about the evolution of my thinking in that space. But first, let's just go to a commercial break, and I'm going to play a very short video on back to bikes, which is something that takes a lot of my energy. Unfortunately, not enough of my time. I have to work during the day, but I have a bit of a passion about bikes, so hopefully you can hear this as well. So there you go. That's a very brief glimpse into Back to Bikes. It's a community workshop. It's run by volunteers. It's a nice place to be. Everybody likes going there, fixing bikes, having some fun, doing some interesting stuff. And over time, we've grown. So we started out on a Monday. I used to take the day off because I was working for an American company and they didn't work on my Monday. So I snuck out and set it up. And it's grown to the point where it's now open 6 days a week. And we're turning about 220,000 Australian dollars a year. So it's actually become quite a significant enterprise. And we've begun to need some systems as well. And I've progressively recruited different groups of students who are on a learning journey in whatever technology, and I make them use Meteor and build some stuff for me. So it's kind of cool. All right, so let's have a look at Meteor Kitchen. So this is Petar Kaponec. I probably said it wrong, but it's somewhere close. He's Serbian, I think. My wife thinks he must be a terrorist because he comes from Serbia, but he's clearly not. I think this is a picture of him in some kind of, I think it was a power station or something, a sort of Soviet era lab. Brilliant guy, done a lot of really cool stuff. His idea was to build this application generator and have plug-in modules, and you could configure them and you could wire them together such that you could build applications with it. It was a pretty great idea. And there were lots of different modules in there. He didn't open source it. I was on at him for quite a while to try and do that, but he resisted that. He said a lot of the code was in C++, and he wasn't proud of it. And he also had some opportunities with some bigger companies, but they didn't come to anything. So anyway, having a look at what it did, was pretty good at generating, up CRUD pages for database. So you could edit your tables, your data, you could add new, you could sort and search and all that kind of stuff. And you could define different tabs across there. It had authentication, it had photo plugins, all that kind of stuff. One of the problems with it was that the source code for this was in JSON. And it's pretty hard to edit JSON to write anything more than a few lines of code. We did have a look at doing it in YAML, and that's a little bit better, but it's still highly structured and very sensitive to mistakes. There's a bit of a problem that it's a one-off activity, and I'll talk some more about that in a minute. And you can't maintain the definitions without starting again, basically, and regenerating the thing. All right, one of the ideas I had, because I said to him, the JSON's kind of a pain in the neck to do. So we hit on this idea of having a human readable specification where you basically would tell it a story in sort of semi-technical terms, where you describe what your set of collections were and what the pages were and what the fields that you wanted to display on the page were. You've got collection keywords and pages. So he wrote a very simplistic parser, which kind of just really picked out keywords. It's sort of second guess things, so it wasn't sophisticated. And it was actually pretty effective in generating code quickly from a simple description. So it was a whole lot easier than writing JSON to do that. I did a Google on code generators. I looked for awesome code generators, and it came back saying top 935 code generation open source projects on GitHub. So code generators are a really common thing. A lot of people have written them, and they vary in size and quality. Meteor Kitchen is one of them. Create React App is another, which you probably all know. And then there's a whole bunch of like Yeoman templating system, and that's a system that you can write your own plugins and do your own scaffolding and stuff. And that was kind of popular for a while. I'm sure it's so yeah, there's a whole world of code generation. I think that code generation is good for stuff that's like a one-off, like the Create React app example. Instead of having to write all that boilerplate code, it just spits it out for you. It takes a moment and then it goes, okay, there's a starter project. There's like a file that you start editing, off you go. So that's great for that kind of stuff. But it sort of falls down a bit in the software development. So disappointed that Peter didn't want to really share his Meteor Kitchen thing. I embarked on my own journey doing that. And I basically said, well, if I start with a schema, which describes my data, a bit like that, the human readable code, I can define my data structure. And then if I have a bunch of templates, I can then write this script that merges those things and creates things like my Meteor publications, my subscriptions, my routes, and then the actual pages of the application itself. And I spent a bit of time doing that over time. And here's one of the templates for the actual schema. So you'll see it's a very simplistic thing that, like this templated columns is where the columns from the schema that you provide it will land. And then there's this my collection schema and my collection. So there's keywords in there that the templating engine is going to replace. So basically you provide a bunch of templates and then you throw this templating thing at it, and then you end up with a set of files. On the server, you've got publications, you've got a placeholder for functions, you've got a methods file, you've got a test for those methods. So there's a template there that I think it creates like a very simple test. It's just starting the schema itself, the simple schema. And then on the front end, it creates a bunch of files for the CRUD, the create, read, update, delete. So basically there's the list, which is the list of them, list and lister, edit and the editor. And the idea is that each of these components, like the edit component is the React component for displaying the edit page. And then the editor contains all the Meteor code that talks to the subscription, does the write to the database, all that kind of stuff. So that's the set of files that it produces. And the idea was, and this kind of evolved over time, that there would be a config file that would drive that. So I tried to make it more and more generic by having this config file that defined, in the list, these are the columns that were going to be displayed, and in the add, these are the fields that you're going to have, and in the view, those are your header and all that kind of stuff. So that sort of evolved and became, the idea was that in order to make changes to it, I could just go to the config and most of what I needed to do was available in there, and I didn't have to write custom code, because that's the problem with, if you start writing custom code, then you lose the benefit of the code generation. So I was trying to maintain that as long as possible by extending my customization options. All right, so this is what it looks like. This is using React Material UI. The React Tabulator is a component that I use for that, because at the time it was kind of the best thing around. It gave me an awful lot of features out of the box. So like the ability to search and sort, filter, do in-memory pagination. So, typically for smallish record sets, if it's a few hundred records, you can have them all in memory, and then you just paginate on screen. It has options for server-side pagination as well. And I put standard buttons across the top for, create a CSV, do a search, delete and add, you tick the box to select them. And then you could also archive the records as well. And then if you went in to edit something, I was using uniforms, basically again from the schema, to say, well, okay, here's your data, throw it up on screen and you can edit it. So it gives you a pretty fast way to, if you're writing some code and you need another collection in there, I could create the schema, which is something I had to do anyway. And then I'd run this code generator and it would spit out the CRUD functions. It gave me the list, it gave me the routes. I just had to plug it into the main routes. So I could have a new collection up and running in a matter of minutes. You know, it was probably not much more than the time it took me to work out what the fields are in that schema, and then I could generate it. And that was kind of okay for the most part, because as I evolved the schema in the table, then I could extend stuff. So, you know, it was sort of a light touch. So I've had value out of this. I mean, I've probably spent, you know, countless hours developing it in order to save myself, you know, an hour at a time, an hour or two at a time. Not sure of the absolute value of that, but I kind of enjoy doing it. I guess I'm like most lazy programmers, that you'll spend time writing code in order to save yourself time. All right, so fast forward some time, there were issues with that. The templating thing is a one-off. It's a little bit sort of clumsy. And there's a whole new generation of things like what they call low-code or no-code platforms. So the examples of like NoCodeDB is an open source one, which is basically a clone of Airtable. So Airtable promises to be, you know, what spreadsheets should have been. It gives you the ability to have relationships between sheets in your data set. So it's like Excel, but a bit more powerful. You can then have different views of the data. So you can have it in like a grid type view. You can also have like a calendar type view. You can have a gallery view. You can put it on a Kanban. So this kind of stuff is really gaining traction, because people are picking this up and going, man, I can just manage my work using a tool like this. Like it's a really easy drop in. I don't have to wait for developers to write stuff for me. All right, so my next cut at this was, and I may be quite quick on this, I'm only 18 minutes so far, and half of that was waiting. There'll be plenty of time for questions and dissecting code and stuff a little bit further on. So yeah, problems with code generation were around, you know, the evolution of the code generation creates technical debt. And you get this wreckage along the roadside. You know, every time you do a new version and you generate, then that one's kind of left there and the code's still there, and you don't bother going back. So it's a bit like wrecks of cars in the desert. You know, you go, oh, that's the car I drove for 100 miles, and that's the car I had next, and this was the next version of it, and this is where I put the turbo on. So you end up with this whole sort of mishmash of things. And then once you start manual editing, then it's kind of a one-way street. It's a bit like doing an eject on a Create React app. So those issues were kind of niggling at me all the time, and I wanted my developers to use the tool, but it was always a bit hard for them to use, and they had to understand how to do it. And the plumbing it into the app was a little bit technical, that you had to go and edit in a whole bunch of places. So they end up sort of cutting and pasting, which really didn't make me happy, but that's what they did because it worked and it was kind of easy. But the code was always then littered with mistakes because they'd forgotten to edit something. You know, there's mistakes in there, there's old names. So it wasn't a very clean way of doing things. So my idea for the next generation of this was to make it data-driven, because I thought about it and I thought, you know, I could do this, that the definitions, those config files that I've got could be in the database. So I started playing around with it, and I was sticking with publications. I thought I could dynamically import the schemas, and I can publish those things, and I can make one widget which sort of deals with any collection in the database. So the idea was to make the machinery common, and everything is config or data-driven from the database. And ideally to still allow customization of that down the track, or at least when you update the core engine, that you then don't have to replicate that through your system. You go, well, the engine upgraded, it's done, you know, and it might be that you needed to change some of your configs, but that's a small cost. So basically no more wreckage. That was the idea. No more wrecks along the highway. Okay, I've run out of slides. I'm done. Game over. 20 minutes. That's too short. Okay, let's get into looking at it. Where is it? Find it. No, it's probably back here. Here it is. Okay, so let's go to version 1 of this. So in the admin of the forms, basically, I'll move my picture out of the way. You had the ability to list your things. I'm not sure if you could edit these. Yeah, there's something wrong with that. There is an edit capability. It's not there right now. Challenges with it, like if you've got objects, then they don't display very well. You've got your sorting function, and then you could even do the filtering, works pretty well. I've got this bit of code in there that in your list, when you fetch all of the data from the database, it actually iterates through all of the fields in the data, and it creates one big text field for each row in the table, such that you can then search on something that appears anywhere. So this search field is looking at that search column. So I create a hidden column called search, and I basically put all of the text from the object into that so that you can search it. So that kind of makes it easier than having to have search boxes on each and every column. All right, standard functions, delete, add, download CSV. This archive thing is kind of interesting. Let's see if this actually works. If I select a couple of records, then it'll say, right, you want to archive them, give me a name. So let's say that this is Thursday's backup, or it's just an archive, it's not really a backup. And then, are you sure you want to do this? And then they disappear from the data set. I think they do anyway. They didn't disappear. And then there is an archives collection. Maybe not. Let's see if I can get to it this way. Okay, there isn't one, but that's all right. I'll come back to that. So let's just go back to my forms collection. So this was the version 1 of it. There were a few weird things to do with the site. That if you are on the last page, if there were multiple ones and you change something, then it basically refreshed the whole view. But we fixed that sort of down the track. So let's fast forward to the new version of that, which is the dynamic one. There's a path called /DBA, which is database administration. And we're using now a React. React tabulator is actually a React wrapper around a thing called tabulator, which has got a whole bunch of. See if I can get to it. It looks a little bit dated. It's from another era, but it has a lot of features, so it was kind of convenient at the time to use that. So going back to this one, this is React Data Table, which has a fewer functions, but it has some nice stuff, like it does the state management if you're allowed to edit. Where can I edit something? These are not editable. Okay, I may need to configure something. So it has the same search and sort stuff available for it, and I use the same technique with the data. Oh, I'm not sure if that's actually working, that search. There's a few bugs in it. Okay, no problem. So there is an archives option, and we may, if we go there, we'll find the one that I archived before. And the idea is that you can actually restore. So in the templating engine, I create an archive function for each collection. So you can say collection, in this case it's forms, so you can say forms.archive, and you give it a set of IDs for all the records that you want to archive. And what it'll do is it create in the archives collection, it will create a single record with an array of all of these records and insert them as a single record. And what you also need to do is write a restore, so a forms.restore function, which does the reverse of that. So you need to write the archive and the restore methods such that you can then bring your data back from the dead. And that's kind of not core, but it's a useful feature in this world. All right, so let's say that what I've done here is I've just jumped into this and like, I can now access almost, not, maybe that collection doesn't exist. Maybe there's a settings collection. If I know the name of it, well, that's not very good, is it? Great demo. What about members? Let's try if members works. All right, so basically, if I know the name of a collection, I can get it. But it's like, yeah, okay, this isn't very exciting because it's got an awful lot of stuff in and there's an array in there. So the trick is to say, create a new view. And let's say that this is Mike's view. And then I can add columns. So I can say, I want to see the name, the email, the address, mobile, and my bio, for example. And then I say go, right, add those in. And I can also do some filtering on that. So within this view, I can say, I want to see people with name Mike. Now this may or may not work, but we'll see. And then you can sort by a particular column. So let's sort by name and we'll do ascending on that. And we'll say, all right, let's save that view. And we go back and Mike's view has a list of all the Mikes. Right, so let's say that I add another one and I'm going to add columns again and I should have a clone view. Let's add the nickname, email address, the serial number. That's probably not a real thing, but okay. And then I'm going to say, well, I want to show Johns here. So let's call them Johns. Let's hope that there are some Johns in this world. Ask is not an ion value. Maybe I need to sort by something. There are no Johns. Okay. So let's go back and edit the Johns view. And let's just call it everyone. And we'll get rid of the filter on that and we'll save it. So this view now is everyone. And then I can say, give me the Mikes, give me the everyone. And I can do other stuff. Oh yeah, these are like, some of them they're random names like Haley and Herminio. Those were generated from the database. So this has taken a bit of work to do, but I'm kind of happy with where it is. There are challenges around it because if you go into the view and you say, right, I want to add something, and then if your thing that you're bringing in fact, I think we may have filtered out anything that's an object and made it not available. If you have a foreign key relationship to another table, that's kind of interesting. And that's kind of a next step, I think, that like, let's say that you've got a category. You might want to display the category. So I think that's one of the things we would do next, to say, go to that next table, pull out a column from that table and display it. And it might be that you display more than one thing from that table. If you display the updated at, for example, then this is smart about the type of that field, and it will allow you to sort on it because it's a date type. So the sorting is a little different, and that's quite technical, logical for us sitting here and going, yeah, of course you can sort that. But technically it's actually different because the way the sorting works, because it has to treat it as a date object. All right, so let's have a look at the code behind this. So in here, there's not an awful lot of files. If you look at it, there's some stuff to do with the archives. There's a React context that sits behind it, and that's basically just for state management. There's an index, which is where it starts. There's this collection provider, and then you bring in the grid, and the grid is here. And it pulls in, and we didn't get the subscription stuff to work. It was actually too difficult because of the way the publications and the subscriptions work. It's almost like you've actually got to import the API schema or the collection definition to the client. You can't do it dynamically, like it just refused to work, and then it was all too hard. So we thought, you know what, we'll go to fetching stuff with Meteor methods, and that's kind of okay. Now, I didn't write this code, so I don't know an awful lot about it. Min Nguyen is working with me on this, and he wrote this stuff. There's all kinds of handlers in there, sort of the React state management stuff. It's quite different to the way Blaze works and more complicated. And then we've got, he's done this archives provider in there as well. So, you know, you look at the code and you think, well, there's not much code, but there's a lot of power in the application itself. And we have visions to, in fact, let's just go back to it. And I'm not sure whether we can't edit the records yet, but that's a logical next step. And that's not particularly difficult. And I think the same approach would apply to say, we could define an edit view, different edit views, depending on what it is you're looking at. And then sort of logical extensions of this might be that you would put permissions on those views as well. I think he's already done it in here. He's got this concept of a view can be read only. So that's a very simplistic permission at the moment, but it might be that you just say, I want to let people look at this. I don't want to let them edit. So if I go back to the view here, I think that this one, you can actually change the values of it. So you can say, well, call her Dorothy. That one worked okay, didn't it? I think there was an error on this one because that's a schema thing. It says that's not allowed value. So I actually need to set it to something that it's going to expect. And maybe what we should do is actually have a drop down for that. So I know I'm way ahead of schedule, but I'm sure we can fill it out with questions, right? Like, bring on the questions. What do we do, Jan, to enable questions? Is it something you can do, or do I have to enable it? All right, people can post here and on Pathable. I don't think you can drag columns. What was your biggest challenge? Yeah, good question. I think it was like an evolutionary thing. In fact, that's an interesting question, because one of the big challenges was convincing Min Nguyen that we could do this. He kept going, oh no, you can't do that. You know, it's hard. It's no. And he had trouble getting his head around, because it's a bit meta, right? Because you're kind of using the database to fetch information first. So you actually get the definitions of what you're going to look at, and then you actually call the Meteor method to get the data, and you use that to actually then display it. So it's a little bit complicated. And you know, we had some sort of, what do they call it, robust discussions about how it was going to work, and he was arguing with me all along the way, and I'm going, no, we can do this. It's possible. We can get through. It makes sense. Any other questions? What is your roadmap? Is this a content management? Is it basically a clone of Airtable? One of the things I'd like to be able to do is to be a clone of Airtable. We're quite a long way from being that. But yes, it makes sense. I mean, Airtable does some particular things, like it can let you create columns in your schema on the fly, which I'd like to be able to do with this. Actually, no, that is a little bit challenging because the schema is actually in the code of your collection. So I'm not sure if it's possible to make that fully dynamic. I mean, you probably could, because you can attach a schema to your, when you declare your Mongo collection, then you attach a schema to it. So I suppose there's nothing to stop you saying, well, that schema lives in the database. I'm going to, at system boot up, I'm going to retrieve that schema and I'm going to attach that schema to the collection, and off you go. So that should work. It's a little bit complicated because simple schema uses objects. It's not a JSON schema. So what you'd have to do is basically store it in JSON and then convert it, which is not impossible. I've actually done that because my schema, if I show you my starting point, so if I go, and this is sort of from the early days here, that, where is it? Scripts, templates. It's in the database, schema, manual. So so this is a definition, and in fact, cron jobs is another one. Basically, what I've done is I've turned all of the objects. So in simple schema, it's a string without the quotes. So it means that, because that's not JSON anymore, so it needs to have quotes around it. So I've written some code that basically takes a JSON object like this, and then it converts the strings. It looks for values that are string in quotes, and it says, oh, that needs to be a string object. And then frequency I'll leave alone because that's just a string. Date I will convert, and things like the created at I actually do outside. But yeah, look, it's not impossible to convert that. So you could store the schema in the database, you could retrieve it, you could parse it to make it into a simple schema object, and then you could attach it to your collection. Not a problem. All right, roadmap's a really good question. I've got a guy, Theo, who you'll meet tomorrow. We're doing like a group talk, and he keeps pushing me for, what's the big picture, Mike? What's your objectives in this? So that's kind of evolving. I'd like to get to the level of an Airtable where you could do all of the different views. There's another project, NoCodeDB, which unfortunately, which is open source, and it's written in Vue.js, which is a bit unfortunate. And I've just got a resistance to choosing another tool set. So this one does a lot of what I'd like to do, but it's in a different world. So, and it gets quite hard to then adapt that to Meteor, and, the distance to getting this to work is lengthy. But I can certainly steal ideas from this, and maybe it could become, well, I mean, all this code is open source, so people can go in, and this one's got like gallery view and stuff, so it's all very cool. Maybe if we can get enough people to like this thing, or not just like it, but sort of say, I want to help, I want to contribute, we could actually make it into something, you know, another variant of Airtable, NoCodeDB. Part of my ultimate objective is to say the low-code and no-code systems are a bit of a trap, because you get into them, and I've heard it, you know, with, I think there's a thing called Bubble, which is this really low-code or no-code environment where you can wire things together and you say, right, I'll do a form, and then the action of the form is to send an email or to give a task to somebody. So they have a certain set of infrastructure there and wiring such that you can then build a system and then you can make it work. And it's pretty good. Like, you can get up and running, you know, in days rather than weeks and months and years. But the problem is that you hit a roadblock, because as soon as you want to do something custom, they just go, oh no, we can't do it. Like, that's the set that this thing does. So my idea is to say, well, let's build a set of no-code or low-code widgets and features that you can do, but then let's make it extensible as well, so that you can say, okay, it's now time to plug in custom code. Then we can do that. Like, we can just plug in a React component to it. And if it's all open source and then we build it in the right way, then I think that that's feasible. So yeah, I'd be interested if anyone wants to help out with the project. I've got you know, the students sort of roll through, they come and go. So it's a little bit haphazard, but you know, there's effort that goes into it. And there's some stuff that I'll show you tomorrow night, which they've done really well. And that's another work in progress, but it's good. It's good to play with these things. All right, any more questions? And the end user interface, is it still coded? Not quite sure what you mean on that in terms of, well, at the moment, this is, you know, like, it's part of a Meteor project. It's a tool, it's basically a developer tool right now. So any of you could find the code and take the code and pop it into your project, presuming you're in React and Mongo, and you could drop it in and you could use this for your database editing. So that's kind of a useful tool for you straight away. I guess that another project might be to say, well, how would we let end users, I think we're quite a way away from having it sort of like an Airtable, create a sheet, drop stuff into it. But then, you know, yes and no. I mean, if you look at this kind of feature, you know, you've got the ability to add things. You can't add columns at the moment. And then you've got this drag and drop thing, so you can actually resort them and change the view and then say, right, submit it. So, you know, the tech is kind of there. You know, a lot of the building blocks begin to be there, and you go, well, okay, now that we've got over the hump of going, we can do this, then we can extend it. And I always believe in, you know, you build something and then maintaining it and extending it becomes easier once it's up and running. So that's kind of where I think. Does that answer the question? Bernat, is it? How do you say your name? It's a pity you can't talk as well. I mean, if I create the data structure here, but I don't want. Yeah, that's fine. You can just hide your hide all these things in your routes. So you can put in secure routes. So it's just your database admin. It could be that you might want to expose, and that's the way Min has built this at the moment, is this is the Swiss Army knife. So the viewer is the editor at the same time. And I want him to actually separate those out and say viewer is a separate thing. And it might be that your route, well, in fact, you see it's there already. So the Johns are part of the route. So if I go the mics, it's not quite right because there's an apostrophe in it, isn't it? So he's slugified it. So mic-s. So you can actually select this through the route. So you've got some capabilities there. I think we would take the editing off by default, and there's some configuration to do to make it a little bit more sort of usable and deployable. Cool. All right, that makes me feel a bit better. I've almost used up the whole hour. I'm not just at past and going, oh, what do I say next? But please ask questions. Anyone want to help? Yeah, I'm sadly too busy with other projects. Yeah, that's fair enough. I think you're a bit like me. You're probably massively overloaded, and you're trying to escape to Japan as well. Is it on GitHub? Yes, it is. It's in. I'll grab the URL. And it's the branch. Even if you don't want to contribute, if you've got suggestions, then feel free to jump in. I mean, we'd be very happy if people can, you can see there's a whole bunch of activity going on this project. So yeah, we've got multiple streams going on, and it's interesting. It's good. It's cool stuff. I can assign people to talk. Okay, that's cool. All right. Well, look, if anyone's got more questions, or I can enable you, or we could just have a quick break before the next meeting. If there is silence, I'll assume the latter is the case. Oh, Chris is here. Yeah, cool. And Jack, hey guys. All right. Well, look, I guess I'll close the meeting and see you in the next one. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Jack. All right, see ya.